Hey everyone, welcome back. Um, First, I would like to apologize for being absent. Life was lifing, work was working, summer was summering, um, and everything was happening really, really fast. So I do apologize. But I'm back now. So, yeah, I am thinking of posting every other week now on Thursdays. But of course, I'll let everyone know if anything changes as well with that plan. Um, yeah, some busy things are happening for me. Anyways, I'm really excited about the topic for today, and I'm just going to jump right in it without further ado. So, first, I would like to open with a question. The question is it possible to watch a war unfold online and still feel human? And is silence a form of complicity? Today we're talking about and exploring something that has been on my mind a lot recently, and maybe on yours too, or other people can relate a lot too. And we're going to be talking about war. Yay! We're going to be exploring the emotional cost of witnessing a war in real time, the dehumanization that it brings with it, and just war theory and pacifism. I want to note first that today's episode is not a political debate, it's an existential inquiry into how we process violence, ethics, and survival. And just to take a moment to acknowledge these feelings as well, because I feel like they're not really acknowledged enough with today's fast paced society. So, this isn't about picking sides, it's about humans. And I just want to also remind everyone that this is a safe space and to approach with an open mind, as always. Welcome back to Existential Office Hours with your host, Lori. So before we get into it, obviously, you know the drill. We're going to do the land acknowledgement. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm currently broadcasting this podcast on stolen land that was once rich in generations of culture, biodiversity, sacred traditions, and wisdom passed down through generations, was disrupted by colonization and bears the scars of history. Nevertheless, it continues to heal and generate and regenerate despite ongoing violence. This land remains deeply rooted in indigenous identity of those that were here before us, those from the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe and the Wendake-Nuenso nations. Acknowledging these nations is important to me as a black woman whose home was previously colonized and is now changed by these systems to address systemic oppression and colonization that continues to happen in our world today. The Mississauga, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe and the Wendake-Nuenso people of this land are not forgotten, despite the injustices and displacement they have faced. Like the Anishinaabe values, I'm committed to reconciliation and minimizing my impact on the environment. I continue to learn from, support, and uplift these communities, and I urge you to find your own ways to support Indigenous rights and communities following their values. Beautiful. Okay. I think that's actually a really great way to get into what we're going to be talking about today because it's quite fitting. The land acknowledgement. Anyways, so the first topic I wanted to talk about, just to get this feeling acknowledged, is the feeling of fatigue of watching a war unfold online, or just any sort of violence online, really, I feel like is applicable. But today we're talking about war, so that's what we're doing. Um, yeah, there's a strange thing that happens when you see like any type of violence online. And in this podcast, I'm just gonna be saying you as like general, not you specifically. Don't feel personally attacked or anything. Um, so yeah, there's a strange thing that happens when you see any sort of violence unfold through a screen. Um, and in this case, it's war. At first, it's really consuming. It's heart aching. Your heart breaks. You repost. You grieve the people you've never even met. Um, and it's like so much to bear. But then over time, something shifts, kind of. You're like scrolling past another tragic post and another tragic post and another tragic post. And I'm not saying this to minimize the power of the posts, I'm just explaining the process. And as you scroll past those, you don't cry or feel like the same you did initially. You just keep scrolling, or leave the app or do whatever you do, essentially. And in the moment, it's not that you don't care, like, to acknowledge, it's not that you don't care. It's just that your body, brain, emotional capacity doesn't have that capacity and that energy to give your all, like, anymore. At least I know I relate to this. And it's the reality, really, of bearing witness to all this violence in such a digital age. We constantly have the world at our fingertips, and we're invited and expected even to absorb the pain of like others in the world in real time without even having the tools to process that. Um, and obviously having peers and everything is so great to have that can help you process it, but this isn't a light topic we're talking about. It's not something that can be like talked about easily, and you also have to be mindful of other people's headspace and what that could mean for them as well. And especially in with topics like this, it's kind of like nuanced, and a lot of organizations don't really acknowledge this either. So it's kind of like, where do you get that support from when you're feeling these big feelings? So, yeah. Somewhere between the chaos of what's happening to real people in real time, we start experiencing and feeling less and less and less. And it's kind of numbing. And I want to talk about that numbness briefly today because it's a jarring feeling. I don't think anyone like welcomes it necessarily or wants to feel that when they're witnessing people going through something painful or hurting. And I the disconnection, it's a part of the process, that disconnection of when compassion meets burnout, like your compassion starts to get burnt out, and you ask, like, we have to ask what happens to our humanity when war becomes just another piece of content. Like, that's really scary to think about. It's really scary to think about. And it's a scary thought to have, yes, but it's the reality that many people are facing, like myself. And like I said, it's not to minimize the content or the power of that content. I think it's still important to share and post everything, but I also think it's important to talk about these topics so people can acknowledge their feelings and realize what's happening in real time to them, because this is really important. I feel like. Yeah, and when we start to become desensitized to to the content, or we start to normalize it, which is even worse. Um, if you think about it, like normalizing violence, war happening to other innocent people, that's insane, or at least it seems insane. And I don't need to list the countless articles and journals that have found habitual exposure to violence content results in desensitization of violence, and repeated exposure can normalize violence as well. Like, at this point, it's basically common sense. But if you do want the articles, please feel free to reach out in the comments. Um, so yeah, it's just like it's what happens. It's human nature. After you're constantly exposed to these things, you kind of start to get more desensitized to it. Um, and it's kind of like there's kind of guilt that comes with not feeling as much as you should, like that initial time. If you felt so much, you cried, you reposted, you whatever. um, I think knowing you're going through those feelings of desensitization is a really like guilt ridden feeling, and especially like having that awareness that you're becoming desensitized. And I can't say I'm becoming desensitized because obviously, if you're like if you're aware of what's happening, how desensitized are you getting? But just having that awareness of what's happening is really scary because that's not something people should want to be desensitized to necessarily. Um, and yeah, it's really scary. So I can't say I'm fully desensitized, but I can say that, you know, I have to avoid some content. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other people too, because it makes people more emotional. So it begs the question, are we really desensitized if we're avoiding the content or trying not to be too engaged in things that make us emotional, um, and things we not necessarily don't want to see, but things just make us really sad. So yeah, being exposed to all of that can definitely be a little um, draining, but I want to acknowledge that's a very privileged point to have and a very privileged stance to have because it's not happening to me. I'm sure the people that it's happening to don't want it happening to them. I'm sure they're drained, but all jokes aside, it is really upsetting and emotionally taxing when you are seeing people go through things, and sure, you can share and like and repost, but knowing that there's not much that you could do to actually like help and change the future outcome is another type of sadness, I feel like, and another type of guilt that people experience witnessing this and bearing witness to this age. It makes me wonder for humanity overall, um, and just this is probably crazy anyways, but we all know how great humans are at adapting to their current situation and things. So makes me wonder if the plan of the big corporations or something is to have people exposed to so much content and whatever that they get desensitized to things just to perpetuate these cycles. Because, like, after a point of seeing so much, maybe they hope it fizzles out. I don't know. That's probably a crazy thought. Um, but yeah, it's also just challenging overall to find a balance between staying informed with tragic things, quite frankly, and not experiencing emotional overstimulation. Um, yeah, because I will cry. I will cry if I start to, dig. And it's, like I said, it's really hard to place that boundary, and it's even harder to acknowledge that there's not much you could do, like you as your being. Maybe you can sign petitions and donate and all that, but it's not helpful sometimes, not knowing the outcome that it'll really have. And I want to hold space for those feelings. Today's kind of a sad episode, so maybe I should have put a warning. Anyways, we're halfway there. So my next point that I wanted to just like flow into is how we even do that. Like, first we talked about the fatigue, and then now I want to kind of talk about how people might moralize that. Not that it's moral, obviously, but yeah, like, it's just the human condition. Another part of my human condition series, how people tend to dehumanize others and the othering mentality. And I learned about this obviously from my degree, but if you don't already know, othering is a social concept that is used to create boundaries between us and them. It's essentially involving constructing differences between groups, often to reinforce dominance of a certain group over another. I'm sure you can probably think of a few examples. It's just a fancy term for a bunch of other terms, but it's used to justify unequal treatment, discrimination, racism, things like that, like exclusion of those we label as other, whether it doesn't matter like what group you're in, it just, labels the other group as not a part of your group. So, yeah, and it ties into human dehumanization, really, which is, of course, what groups at war want us to believe. Probably either side. And it's really, like I said earlier, a matter of like trying to make things moral, and I feel like that's not the right word to use, but regardless, that's something humans do, which is unfortunate, and I'll get into more detail about that later on because that's going to be the bulk of the episode. But yeah, it essentially looks at how like we're the good guys and they're the bad guys or the other. So like, we're always, or whatever group we're a part of is always the good group, whether you're wrong or not. That's how it's kind of seen as. And like I said, I'll get into more of what that philosophy and mindset might look like, but the social concept is essentially what is, I believe, what propels people to motivate groups to partake in wars, really, and see it as just. Because I personally don't think that's ever the answer, but we'll get into what might be and isn't the answer later because I don't even know anymore. I just know that violence is bad, but is it always bad? We don't know. So yeah, but regardless, dehumanization and othering contributes to what, creates a war. If everyone saw everyone as their brothers and sisters and, they're the same group, no one would really be like, oh, they're the bad guy, let's fight against them or let's do whatever to them. And this whole mindset of seeing our own human species never gets old, of seeing our own kind as like outside of us, fosters dehumanization in itself. And the more I read my book, I'm still reading that book, guys. It's a really long book, and I've also been busy. But um, the more I read it, the more I realize, like, it's really crazy how far humans have come. I'm referring to Sapiens, by the way. How far humans have come, and how, like, just, like, separated we've become, like, more and more. But anyways, so yeah, and on a smaller scale, just to help you comprehend the idea of othering and dehumanization and things like that, we can also consider how slaves were seen as the other outgroup and dehumanized quite literally, like when slavery was happening. Um, yeah, some of the things I learned that happened during slavery was insane. Is insane, not was, but yeah, and it's really, really disheartening. So yeah, it's the mindset that people that were above black people were they created such like awful and dire circumstances and situations and conditions for the community simply because we weren't seen as human equals. And it's still in place sometimes today. People obviously still believe that, some people, but that's not our topic for today. The apartheid is not our topic today. But you can see how this mindset can get really messy from this example, and how it can continue to be in place today, even if it happened years ago. It's not something we fully recovered from. And that scares me for the future, like post-war things, because like, how do you even recover from a war? Like, obviously, like, you can build infrastructure and whatever, I guess, over stolen land, I guess, but like, how, like, that's like slapping a band-aid on a bigger issue, like on a broken foot or something. Anyways, I don't want to run too over time. I knew this was going to be a long episode regardless, but I have one more thing to talk about, and that's the bulk of it. So this is going to be, I just want to talk about just war theory and pacifism for a bit. Just war theory and pacifism for a bit, because I feel like they're two of the opposite spectrums, kind of. Or they're on separate parts of a the line, and they're like there. So yeah, and essentially, just war theory is a doctrine, theory, fundamental, whatever. I can't even say the name because then she'll hear. Anyways, just war theory is a doctrine that deals with the justification of how and why wars are fought. It argues that war can be morally justified, but only under strict conditions. Versus pacifism, which essentially is the belief that violence, especially war, is never morally justified, regardless of the cause or the outcome. So I'll break each of these down a bit. Pacifism is pretty straightforward, but I'll break just war theory down a bit quickly, because it raises some really good points for initiating, I don't know, a war, but also pacifism is, I'm leaning more towards that personally, but I also understand both sides, kind of. I'll get into it after I explain what each are. So this will be our philosophical take for the day, and ethical take for the day. So just war theory basically is looking at the ethical reasons for a war, and the reasons going to war, like how you can justify it, essentially. So essentially there's three groupings for it. They're all in like Latin, I think. So just ad bellum is the pre-war, so justice for going to war. just in bello is the justice during the war, so while war is happening, and just post bellum is justice after the war, so post war. Won't take too long here, but the justice for going to war, so the pre-war, it looks at examples and doctrines like it must be for a morally sound reason. Um, the motive must be for peace and justice, nothing else, not violence. All non-violent options must have been exhausted, absolutely. And you can't go to war if it'll end up bringing more harm than good, essentially, is what that's saying. And the just and bello, so during the war, looks at examples like treating prisoners of war humanely and not torturing them or hurting them, and also like treating only or targeting only people that are part of the war, so I guess like soldiers and things like that, not like innocent civilians. And then just postbellum, justice after the war, looks at restoration of peace and holding people accountable, and just restoration of the place the war happened, I guess, overall. So yeah, that's just war theory, and I want to acknowledge these ideas and thoughts are traced back to people like Cicero, St. Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas as well, mostly Thomas Aquinas from what I've seen. And then, on the other hand, pacifism, on the other side of the spectrum, is the belief that war can never be morally justified, regardless of the cause or the outcome. So, there's a few different types and different kinds, but essentially they're saying the same thing, that violence can never lead to peace, only violence, and it can never truly be justified. So yeah, and with that, knowing that and hearing those ethics and what pacifism is and what just war theory is, it's hard to say which side one would be on. Because I understand that just war theory sounds really, moral and ethical and whatever, and like you have to exhaust all your options, which I feel like if you've truly exhausted all your options, you shouldn't have to go to war. But I understand people also have to fight for war, because not everyone's understanding. Which sucks, but I understand that. So with that, I kind of understand just war theory. If you're trying, like, let's take fighting for your freedom, for instance. If, I don't know, captivers or whatever are not listening or not wanting you to be free, like with slaves or with slavery, like you couldn't just like sit back and be peaceful and try to have a peaceful protest, and like they will result with violence, so you kind of have to be violent back. It's kind of like defending yourself. It's like expecting the victim not to defend themselves. So with that, I don't really agree with pacifism, because I feel like you can defend yourself, and after a point, like, why wouldn't you? So yeah, like if they're inflicting violence, why wouldn't you? But I feel like with just war theory, that's kind of what people, in an ideal world, people would want a war to be like, only ending in peace, like not doing more harm than necessary, exhausting every options. But I don't think that's ever what happens, and I think there's a lot of blurred lines. So it's important, there are important points to acknowledge, and I bring it up because in modern warfare, civilians are often impacted. There's a lot of gray. Okay, a lot of gray. And it's not funny, and it's not cute, it's not demure either. So, yeah, a lot of civilians are impacted, motives are blurred, and propaganda is heavily used. Things are bent and manipulated and weaponized to justify a war after it's already begun. So I feel like even if people did go into a war expecting to use the doctrines and the theories of just war theory, things would end up being bent anyway, which is not cool, but it's the modern day and age, I suppose, after it's already begun. as well, it seems like people kind of like fall for this propaganda and the reasoning that is pushed out into the media. And obviously, I'm not gonna go into detail or whatever, but I think it's like really important to do your own research and see the sides. Not even sides, this isn't about sides, just like do your own research and know what's happening and not always believing everything that's pushed to you, because I think that's really important. And I think in the current state of the world, um, they want people to not think. I don't know who they is, big corporations, I don't know, politicians, I don't know, but I think it's important to just like always know how to think and do your own research regardless. So yeah, and while pacifism might seem kind of naive, I'm like bouncing back, playing devil's advocate for both. But while pacifism might be kind of naive to like not have any violence ever, it's not about ignoring violence, rather it's about refusing to replicate it. you know like if we want peace, we have to replicate that, is what pacifism is saying. And how crazy it is to want peace but to initiate a war. It's kind of paradoxical. But I also understand the side of just war that's like, okay, but if violence is being inflicted upon you, you can't just have peace, babe. So, I don't know. I I don't know. Um, and in a world where entire communities are erased under the justification of self-defense, pacifism asks, can you fight evil without becoming it? Can you? I don't know. I don't know. Anyways, the line between protecting a life and violating it are razor thin. And these frameworks just allow some guidance to shape how we draw that line. Asking, when is violence ever truly justified? And is peace ever possible to achieve through war? I don't have the answers. if one thing's for sure, I don't have the answers. Never have. But I think it's important that we discuss these things and hold space for them regardless. Watching violence unfold on our screens like constantly, and knowing that that is someone's mother, father, brother, child, is chilling. And it's not fun to experience. It can get numbing. Knowing a lot of people also don't see others like that can also be numbing if they see them as other or dehumanize them to kind of moralize it. And it could be scary even more for the future of our world, because we all know that geographical luck is quite in play. But what happens to regular civilians that are considered other right now? Like, what's drawing that line from making us the other, and dehumanizing us in another political or social context? It's really scary to think about. And we also discussed some different theories for moralizing violence, or not. Perhaps because we don't want to face the truth of the horror of war and see what we've become or what we've been encouraging. Some people, I guess, at least. But I have a question for everyone before we go. I have to go because I'm running over time. What would justice look like if everyone involved was fully seen as human? With their own lives, their own stories, and not grouped together as a group. Just individual humans. Thanks for listening with me today. I know today was a really heavy topic, but I thank you for staying this far. And please Continue to have grace and continue to give yourself grace as well. I love you. Bye.